It's a new year. What better time to talk about the Egyptian calendar on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible? Well, 2020 is over, thank goodness. We're now into 2021, a new year. So it's a perfect opportunity to talk about the intricacies of the Egyptian calendar. And if you like these videos and wish to help out, please hit that subscribe button. It really matters to us. And if you want to help us financially, please consider becoming a Patreon member or buying my book, The Ark of the Covenant in its Egyptian Context, an illustrated journey. Okay, so we're going to talk today about the Egyptian calendar. And when we talk about units of time, we kind of all assumed that these units always existed. Years, months, days, seasons, weeks. And the fact is that a lot of these units had to be either discovered or defined. Now, for every culture had a concept of a day. Now, cultures could differ as to when the day began. Some cultures believe it began at sunrise, some at sunset, some at midnight. So each culture could define a day differently, but it had a notion of a day because it could see the sunrise and the sunset. Similarly, most cultures had a concept of a month because it could see the phases of the moon. It could see the moon, the new moon, the crescents, the full moon, and cultures could define a lunar cycle for themselves. So just about every culture had a concept of a month. Now, when we get into other units of time, things start getting a little more tricky. For example, our definition of a solar year, 365 and a quarter days, was defined by the Romans, henceforth the Julian year, named after Julius Caesar. But cultures before then often had different definitions of a year. And some cultures actually came to adopt a year relatively late, depending upon what sort of culture it was. If it had a strong sense of seasons, it was more likely to define a year. Some cultures, because they had radical shifts in their environment over the year, defined a year early. In the ancient Near East, the earliest culture to adopt the year is actually the Egyptians, at around 3000 BC. It wouldn't be another 500 to 700 years until the Mesopotamians adopt the concept of a year. So the Egyptians, in many respects, are the early adopters of a defined year. Some of the reason is because they had this inundation cycle. They have this dramatic flood that forces everyone to move once a year at roughly the same time. So this makes a definitional year pretty easy. And they were actually able to figure out that a year was 365 days. Now, they also, because they had a lunar cycle, they had two kinds of months. They had an observational month, and they had what was called a civil month. An observational month is basically they look at the phases of the moon and decide when the new month begins. And that's 29 and a half days. So sometimes the lunar month is 29 days, sometimes the lunar month is 30 days. On the other hand, the civil month was defined as being 30 days across the board, and it was always 30 days. And each month, they divided into 3 weeks. 3 weeks of 10 days. Really even. So their work week was also 10 days a week. Of course, it wasn't like our work week where we get 6 days on and a day off. They take 9.5 days of work and you get a half day off. So you kind of get really cheated on the Egyptian work week. So I don't think anyone wants to go back to that. Now, when we talk about how the Egyptians arranged their months, they broke down the year into 12 months of 30 days. So when you calculate all that together, you have 360 days. But they knew that the year was 365 days. What did they do with that extra 5? What they did was they took those 5 days and they pasted it on the end of the year as what's called Epidominal Days. These were special festival days, 5 days, celebrating the birth of the great gods, essentially the 5 children of Geb, the earth god, and Nut, the sky goddess. Yes, the earth god in Egyptian is a male. And this really shocks students when I tell them this for the first time because they're so used to thinking of Mother Earth. Earth being a female entity. It isn't that way in Egypt. In Egypt, Earth is a male entity. It's Father Earth. Okay? So, at these festivals, each of those days marks the birth of one of the 5 children of Geb and Nut. The first Epidominal Day is dedicated to Osiris, god of the dead. The second day is to Horus. Now, we have to be careful here because in Egypt we have more than one Horus. We have Horus the Avenger, which is the son of Isis and Osiris who avenges his father. This is not that Horus. This is not Horus the Younger. This is Horus the Elder. The Horus the Elder is kind of a placeholder god. We don't know a lot about him. He doesn't really fill in a large role in Egyptian mythology. But he is listed as one of the children of Geb and Nut. The third day is to the god Seth, also known in some literature as Sutek. He's a god of power, he's a god of strength. And later on, he sort of fills the antagonist or the evil god. And early on in Horus myth, he is sort of the representation of Lower Egypt, as he kills off Osiris, and then the son of Osiris, who's Horus the Younger, or the Horus the Avenger, avenges his father against Seth. The fourth day is dedicated to Isis. And she's one of the goddesses of the dead. She escorts the dead to the afterlife. She's also sister and wife to Osiris. And then finally, the last day of the year is dedicated to the goddess Nephthys. And Nephthys was the sister of Isis, the spurned wife of Seth. And she is another goddess that helps escort the dead, along with her sister Isis. And I'm not going to get deep into Osirian mythology here, but the 5 epigomenal days represents the birth dates of those 5 gods that were the children of Geb and Nut. Okay, so we now have filled out our 365 days. Now, how did they arrange their months? Because in the Northern Hemisphere, we have 4 seasons. Well, the Egyptians actually identified 3 seasons. of 4 months each. And when we start talking about seasons and calendar systems in the ancient Near East, things get a little tricky, and I'll explain why in a moment. The first day after the fifth epigomenal day was the season of Akhet. Akhet is the season of inundation. The next 4 months is called Peret. Peret is the season of planting. Sometimes in some literature it's called winter. And the final season of 4 months is called Shemu. And that's the season of harvest. And some literature called summer. Now, one of the things about the Egyptian calendar that we have to be really, really cognizant of is it is 365.0 days. It doesn't take into account that 0.25 days of a natural solar calendar. So what happens is the calendar shifts over 1460 years. Every 4 years, the calendar shifts by 1 day. So the seasons move across the calendar. This is why during the early Middle Kingdom, we have a writing of one of the administrators who got sent to Serebit el-Khadim, who is complaining that he has to deal with the heat of winter. And as that seems very strange to us, because in most contexts, winter is a cold month. But at the time he was sent to Serebit el-Khadim, the seasons had shifted. So basically, in the ancient world, seasons are treated almost more like labels until a calendar becomes standardized to intercalation. Now, intercalation is just a fancy word that means you're syncing your calendar with the solar cycle. For example, the Hebrew calendar, much later on, shortly before the Babylonian exile, starts intercalating their calendar. So this is where the second month of Adar comes in. It's to sync up the calendar with the solar cycle, because the Hebrew calendar is an observational lunar calendar. It can vary in the number of days of the year, quite substantially, sometimes by like 11 days or more. So that is how the calendars worked in the ancient world, and that's how the Egyptian calendar worked. It was a 365-day calendar, 12 months of 30 days, 5 epigomenal days, each month with 3 weeks of 10 days. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.